The desert doesn't forget. It keeps its secrets buried beneath layers of dust and silence, waiting for someone foolish or determined enough to listen. For nearly 3 decades, the town of Ash Creek, Nevada, sat quietly on the edge of nowhere, surrounded by miles of cracked earth and rusting fences, its people bound together by memory and habit. Nothing ever really happened there, until the day Detective Eli Mercer opened a safe that should never have existed. It was late afternoon when the call came in. A construction crew renovating the old Ash Creek Sheriff's Office had found a sealed floor safe beneath the evidence room. The building hadn't been used since 2004, when the department relocated across town, leaving behind a ghost of its former self. Eli drove out there expecting nothing more than old paperwork and rusted handcuffs. He was wrong. The safe was wedged deep into the concrete, the dial frozen with time. The foreman had already tried forcing it open, but stopped when he saw what was stamped on the door. Property of Sheriff's Office, Archive Thurker 4796. When Eli saw the number, his pulse stuttered. 96, the year that haunted every officer who had ever worked in Ash Creek. The year a local woman named Claire Hensley vanished without a trace. It had been one of the town's darkest unsolved cases, a story people still whispered about in diners and gas stations. The safe had been hidden directly beneath the old evidence shelves, sealed over during a renovation in the late 1990s. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep it buried. The locksmith arrived an hour later. Eli stood over his shoulder, arms crossed, the sound of clicking metal echoing through the empty room. The air smelled of dust and heat. When the lock finally gave, the door creaked open with a metallic sigh. Inside, wrapped in layers of yellowing plastic, was a small cardboard box. Eli crouched and lifted it out carefully. The box was marked simply, Hensley, C, 1996. He froze. Claire Hensley, the case that had defined and then destroyed half the department. He set the box on a nearby table, unwrapped it, and pulled back the lid. Inside were a series of items sealed in old evidence bags, photographs, a cassette tape, a small leather journal, and something heavy wrapped in cloth. He unfolded the fabric and stared at the object in his hand. A revolver. The serial number was scratched out, but the initials carved into the handle were still visible. R.H. The room seemed to tilt. Sheriff Richard Holt, the man who had led the investigation into Claire's disappearance, the same man who retired in 2001 and died 2 years later. Eli had grown up idolizing him. Everyone had. Holt was the law in Ash Creek, a steady hand in a harsh place. The idea that this weapon had his initials burned into it and had been hidden away made something cold crawl up Eli's spine. He called in the evidence team. They photographed everything, sealed it all again, and took it to the new facility downtown. That night, Eli couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the discovery in his mind, the weight of the gun, the smell of dust and metal, the way his hands had trembled. He had been with the department for 15 years, but he'd never felt anything like that before. It wasn't just shock. It was recognition, though he couldn't yet name why. The next morning, he reopened the Hensley case file. The records were sparse. Claire had been 28 when she vanished in the summer of 1996. A schoolteacher, engaged to a mechanic named Brian Keller. Last seen leaving the diner where she worked part-time, heading home around midnight. Her car was found 2 days later, parked along a desert road with a flat tire. The keys were missing. No signs of struggle, no blood, no witnesses. Sheriff Holt had led the search himself, combing the desert for weeks. They found nothing but heat and silence. After 6 months, the case went cold. Eli studied the file for hours, flipping through yellowed pages and faded Polaroids. Something about it didn't add up. Holt's notes were too clean, too deliberate. Every line of inquiry ended abruptly, marked unfounded or no probable cause. It read less like an investigation and more like a performance. He found a note tucked between pages, a torn slip of paper in Holt's handwriting. If they dig, they'll find her twice. He didn't know what that meant, but the words wouldn't leave his mind. The lab results came back 2 weeks later. The gun had traces of blood beneath the handle, degraded but viable. The DNA matched Claire Hensley. Eli stared at the report until his vision blurred. That gun had been used on her, then sealed away by the man sworn to find her. The shock gave way to something heavier, a quiet fury that settled deep in his chest. He spent the next month reconstructing the timeline, piece by piece. He interviewed old deputies who had served under Holt, though most refused to talk. One, a retired officer named Frank Danner, finally agreed to meet him at a bar just outside town. Frank was in his 70s now, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted his glass. When Eli mentioned the safe, the old man froze. "You found it?" he whispered. "I told him to destroy it. He said he couldn't." Eli leaned forward. "Destroy what, Frank?" The man looked up, eyes wet with something that might have been guilt. "The gun. The tape. He said he made a mistake. Said he didn't mean to pull the trigger. But when she fell, he knew it was over. He buried her out near Red Mesa, then came back and built that damn safe. Said it was better if nobody knew. Said the desert would keep her." Eli's throat tightened. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Frank shook his head. "You didn't cross Holt back then. He was the law. You go against him. You disappear right alongside the truth." When Eli left the bar, the night felt colder than usual. The moon hung low, a pale coin above the desert. He drove for miles without turning on the radio, the silence wrapping around him like a shroud. He thought about Claire, about how her name had become just another line in a report. How many others had been buried by the same silence? The next morning, he drove out to Red Mesa. The land stretched endlessly, cracked and dry. He parked his truck and started walking, the heat pressing against his back. He wasn't sure what he was looking for until he saw it. A small wooden cross half buried in the sand, bleached nearly white by the sun. He knelt beside it and brushed away the dust. The ground beneath was uneven, recently disturbed. He called in a forensic team. Within hours, they uncovered human remains. A ring was found near the bones, engraved with the initials CH. It was her. The discovery spread fast. For weeks, Ash Creek was consumed by the revelation that their long-lost teacher had been buried less than 15 miles from town, hidden by the man everyone trusted most. Reporters descended, families whispered, and every old secret seemed to rise with the desert wind. The district attorney reopened the case officially, not to prosecute. The guilty man was already dead, but to document what had been concealed. Eli watched from the sidelines, his role both pivotal and invisible. He'd found the safe, uncovered the truth, but every headline focused on Holt, his betrayal, his fall from grace. No one mentioned how much it had cost Eli to dig that deep. Then, just as things began to quiet again, another envelope arrived on his desk. It had no return address. Inside was a photograph, a Polaroid, faded and slightly torn. It showed two men standing beside a desert truck. One was Holt. The other, younger, was unmistakably Frank Danner. In the corner of the photo, scrawled in blue ink, were 3 words. "There's another one." Eli stared at it for a long time. He'd hoped the story had ended with Claire, but the desert, as he'd learned, never lets go so easily. That night, he returned to the evidence room alone. He set the Polaroid beside the old safe, now empty, and studied it under the light. There was something in Holt's expression, an unease, a shadow just beneath the calm. Eli felt it again, that tremor in his hands, the same one from the day he opened the safe. He realized then that the shaking had never been about fear. It was about knowing that the truth never stays buried. It only waits. Outside, the desert wind howled against the windows, scattering sand like whispers. Eli turned off the light and stood there for a while in the dark, the photograph still in his hand. Tomorrow, he would follow where it led. But tonight, he just listened. To the silence, to the weight of the past, to the sound of his own heart still beating beneath the ghosts. Somewhere in the dark, a voice seemed to echo, soft and distant. If they dig, they'll find her twice. And for the first time, Eli understood. The following morning broke under a pale desert sun that seemed to burn without warmth. The town of Ash Creek was already awake, though nobody spoke about the discovery anymore. They didn't have to. The story had become a kind of unspoken truth, stitched into every glance, every cautious word. Eli Mercer drove out of town before the diner opened, the Polaroid on the passenger seat beside him. The photo had begun to curl at the edges overnight, the ink bleeding faintly where the words had been scrawled. "There's another one." He didn't know what that meant exactly, but the image itself gnawed at him. The truck in the background was old, probably from the late 90s, with a logo barely visible beneath the sun damage. He squinted at it again and made out the faint letters. Silver Basin Mining Co. The company had closed in 2001 after an explosion at one of its sites killed 3 workers. Sheriff Holt had overseen the investigation into that incident, too. It was another coincidence that didn't feel like coincidence. Eli drove out toward the remains of the mine, the landscape flattening into endless stretches of ochre and gray. The wind blew steady, carrying the smell of iron and dust. The main road gave way to dirt, then to nothing at all. He parked the truck and stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the sand. The mine itself was a jagged scar in the earth, the entrance sealed off with chain link fencing and weathered "No trespassing" signs. He slipped through the gap and started walking, each step echoing faintly against the hollow of the desert. The air inside was cooler, still. He moved carefully through the shadows until he reached what remained of an old storage shed. Half the roof had collapsed, and sunlight spilled in through the gaps, illuminating piles of rusted tools and broken crates. Something metallic caught his eye. Buried beneath a sheet of corrugated steel was a tin lockbox, small and unmarked. His heartbeat quickened. He knelt, brushed off the dust, and pried it open with his pocketknife. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, curled and faded. Most were routine evidence shots: desert roads, abandoned buildings, nameless faces caught in grainy stillness. But near the bottom of the stack One stood out. It was Claire Hensley, standing in the doorway of a classroom, smiling, her eyes bright, her hair caught in the light. On the back, in Holt's familiar handwriting, was a single word: practice. Eli stared at it for a long time, his throat dry. Then he noticed something else. Another face recurring in the background of several other photos, always slightly out of focus. A man, tall, wearing a deputy's badge. Frank Danner, the old deputy who had told him everything. Eli drove back into town with the box locked in his trunk. He didn't call the lab. He didn't call the DA. He just drove straight to Danner's house on the outskirts of town. A small, weather-beaten trailer, sitting alone among the scrub. The old man was outside, sitting on the porch with a cigarette in one hand and a Bible in the other. When he saw Eli pull up, he didn't look surprised. "You found it," Frank said quietly. Eli climbed the steps, his voice low but steady. "What's in those photos, Frank?" The old man exhaled smoke, eyes distant. "Things I hoped would stay buried." "Like Claire?" Eli asked. Frank looked at him then, and for the first time, Eli saw something raw behind the old man's gaze. Not fear, but shame. "It started before her," he said. "There was another girl, back in '94, a hitchhiker passing through. Holt picked her up, said she was high, said he'd take her to detox. She never made it. We all knew, but no one talked. You didn't talk about the sheriff." "Why?" Eli demanded. "Why protect him?" Frank's hands trembled as he stubbed out his cigarette. "Because we thought we were protecting the town. He said she was dangerous, said she'd kill the department's reputation if anyone found out what really happened. He buried her out near Silver Basin, told me to help him cover it up. I told him no. A week later, there was an explosion at the mine. 3 men dead. Holt said it was an accident. I knew it wasn't. He'd buried her there and sealed it with fire." Eli felt the world tilt again. The mine explosion, the photos, the safe. It all connected in ways too deliberate to be chance. Holt hadn't just killed Claire. He had killed others to bury his sins. And Danner had lived with that knowledge for nearly 30 years. "Where exactly?" Eli asked. Frank hesitated, then nodded toward the horizon. "There's an old shaft west of the main site. You'll see a bent sign that says Section 3. She's down there." Eli left without another word. He didn't trust backup. Not yet. He didn't want anyone interfering until he knew for sure. He reached the mine again, just as the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of copper and blood. He found the sign easily. It was twisted, half buried, barely legible. The ground around it was scorched, the remnants of the explosion long ago turned to dust. He knelt and began to dig, using his hands at first, then a small spade from his truck. After a few minutes, the earth gave way to wood and metal. He stopped. Beneath the dirt was a charred wooden box, half collapsed from age. He radioed it in. By the time the forensic team arrived, the stars had begun to appear. The box was carefully lifted from the ground and opened under the harsh glare of floodlights. Inside were the skeletal remains of a young woman. She wore a silver bracelet engraved with the initials ML. Her name was Maria Lopez, a 21-year-old hitchhiker last seen near Ash Creek in 1994. Her case had been marked missing, presumed runaway. Holt had investigated that one too. The next few days blurred together. The story exploded across the state. Second victim found. Linked to former sheriff. Old files were pulled, reporters descended again, and the department reeled under the weight of history. Eli gave one official statement, then refused all others. He couldn't stand to hear the questions, the disbelief, the words, hero turned monster, repeated over and over. But one night as he sat alone in his office, a thought came to him. The letter, the photo, they hadn't come from nowhere. Someone had sent them deliberately, knowing what he'd find, and that someone had access to the kind of evidence Holt had hidden. He reviewed the photos again, looking closer this time. In one shot, taken at the mine, the angle suggested a third person behind the camera. Not Holt, not Danner, someone else. He enhanced the reflection on a shard of broken glass in the corner of the frame, and there it was. A woman's face, partially visible, watching from behind the lens. He froze. There had been another deputy back then, one few remembered. Linda Carr, Holt's secretary and part-time dispatcher. She'd left the department abruptly in '97, citing personal reasons. No one had seen her since. The timing was too precise to ignore. Eli tracked her down through old records, finding a forwarding address in Arizona. The trailer park where she lived was quiet, dust blowing between rows of identical homes. She opened the door before he could knock. "Took you long enough," she said, voice hoarse from cigarettes. Eli held up the photograph. "You sent these." She didn't deny it. Someone had to. He stepped inside. The living room was cluttered with boxes, old papers, a single cat asleep on a chair. On the table were more photographs, neatly stacked. "You kept all this?" he asked. Linda nodded. "He thought he could erase everything. But I made copies. Every file, every tape. I told myself I'd turn them in someday, but I was scared." Holt had friends. People higher up who owed him. They would have buried me right beside her. "Why now?" Eli asked softly. She met his eyes. "Because I saw your name in the papers. I knew you'd finish it." She handed him a small envelope, her hands shaking slightly. "This is the last one," she said. Inside was a single cassette tape. The label read June 14th, 1996. Eli borrowed her old player and pressed play. The recording was faint, warped by time. Holt's voice came through first, calm and deliberate. "You'll stay quiet about the mine, about all of it. You understand?" Then another voice, a woman's, trembling. "You can't keep doing this, Rich. Someone's going to find out." A pause, then the sound of a gun cocking, followed by a single shot. The tape ended in static. Linda turned away, tears glinting in her eyes. "That was me," she whispered. "He shot me, or tried to. I played dead until he left. Then I ran. I've been running ever since." Eli sat there for a long time, listening to the tape again and again until every sound etched itself into his mind. When he finally stood, the room felt too small, too heavy with ghosts. Back in Ash Creek, he turned the evidence over to the state. The case was officially closed. Again. Holt was dead. Danner in hospice. Linda under protection. The town held a memorial for the victims. 2 names etched into stone. Space left for others they might never find. People cried, prayed, forgave. But forgiveness, Eli knew, didn't mean forgetting. In the weeks that followed, the department cleaned out the old files, preparing for digitization. Eli stayed late one night, sorting through boxes when he found an envelope tucked behind a drawer. Inside was a photograph of the desert at sunset, Red Mesa, the place where they'd found Claire. Written on the back, in Holt's handwriting, were 5 words. Not all graves are hers. Eli stared at it, a chill running through him despite the warm air. He didn't know whether it was a taunt, a confession, or both. He slipped the photo into his pocket and walked outside. The night air smelled of rain and dust. He stood under the flickering streetlight, looking toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, the desert stretched endlessly, holding its secrets tight. He thought about Holt, about the way monsters could wear kindness like a uniform. He thought about Claire and Maria, about the years lost to silence. And he thought about his own hands the day he opened that safe. The way they'd trembled, not just with fear, but with the weight of everything that comes after truth. He drove out to Red Mesa one last time before dawn. The road was empty, the sky a pale gray. When he reached the ridge, he stepped out and stood at the edge of the valley. The wind moved softly through the sagebrush, carrying whispers that could have been words or memory. He closed his eyes and whispered back, "You're not forgotten." When the first light broke across the sand, he turned and walked away. He didn't look back. The desert didn't need witnesses. It already remembered. And somewhere beneath that endless sky, the safe he'd opened still stood in the evidence room. Empty, but not silent. A hollow reminder that some truths never die. They just wait for someone to dig deep enough to hear them breathing.